The Queen's Gambit. No, it wasn't just a TV series that single-handedly blew up the chess world, and we're all hoping for a season 2. It's actually a real chess opening, and although I usually tell kids to play your king's pawn forward, the simple fact remains, you may have to play against the Queen's Gambit. So today, we're going to talk about strategy 1 for how to play against the QG. Before we get to this video, please go ahead and subscribe to the ChessKid YouTube channel. It costs you nothing, but it makes me very happy. Okay, so after d4, I'm going to advise that you play this move pawn to d5. Do I actually play d5 myself? No, I don't. The alternative is knight f6. Those are the two most common moves, but d5 is solid, it's safe, and it still gives you the opportunity to be your own creative player. Let me explain what I mean. After c4, this is officially the Queen's Gambit because technically white is gambiting a pawn. Now, I'm going to be really honest with you. Truth bomb alert. I don't think white is really gambiting this pawn because if black takes, then white could always get the pawn back with queen check right away. That's like option number 1. Now, white is not usually in a hurry to get the pawn back, but you know, it's not really a gambit if you can get the pawn back right away. Let's go back though. In this video, we're going to talk about what happens when you accept the gambit. And surprisingly, accepting the gambit may be less risky than not accepting the gambit. We'll get to that in a future YouTube video, but let's talk about accepting the gambit today. Black's goal is not usually to keep this pawn. Black's goal is to give the pawn back, but to catch back up in development. Now, white has a couple of options here. There's the tricky line, pawn to e3. Probably not the best move, but the idea is to try to trick black into saving the pawn. And here, if you're black, you should allow your pawn to be captured and just play a regular move like knight f6 and actually transpose to a line that I'm going to show you in a minute. The trick is, if you try to keep the pawn, if you play b5, now you're actually in a world of trouble after a4 because all of your queenside pawns are going to be weak and they're all going to go bye-bye. For example, if you take, well, kids, that's the ugliest pawn formation in the history of chess. You've got 2 sets of double isolated pawns. It's like a really ugly Tetris piece, and white can start picking them off with the bishop and with the queen, and you're going to be left with 2 more isolated pawns on the queen side. You're not going to be very happy. Now, you could play this move a6, but if you play a6, there's trouble. After takes and takes, the a file is open. No, don't do that to yourself. Okay. The last option, if we go back to this position, would be to play the move c6, and now we're going to reveal the big secret why white played e3 and not e4. The reason is white will take you. You'll take back, and you might think you're still up a pawn, but then boom, queen f3 will land on the board, and you have no good way to guard your rook. Technically, you could throw a knight in the way and limit the damage, but it's pretty bad to lose a knight on about the 7th move of the game. This would be a real tragedy. So we're going to go back. If your opponent plays the e3 move, as I said, after e3, don't keep your pawn, just play a move like knight f6. Now, let's go back and see what happens if your opponent plays e4. This looks like a stronger move. Of course, there's no more trick with queen f3 because that pawn would block. Now, technically in this position, you can play b5, but it is not what I'm going to suggest. In this position, what I would do is try to break up white's center right away. So here, what I want you to do is play the move e5, giving the pawn back to break up white's center. Now, white would not be very happy about pushing because then the center would be all blockaded and you could actually play b5 in this position. I'm not sure white is going to get the pawn back so easily, or you could just play the move knight f6. Now, white could play this move knight f3, but white should have probably played it on the previous turn to prevent e5. What happens if white just takes? Well, now I would argue that black is actually even better because black can play queen takes, king takes, and now white can't even castle. And in this position, if you play this move knight c6, this pawn is incredibly weak. This king is on an open file. If white takes your pawn, you'll just take back with the tempo on the bishop. And if white defends the pawn, well, if white plays knight to f3, bishop to g4 is a great move. Now the knight is pinned, this pawn is in trouble, you're about to castle queenside, which will land your rook on d8 with check. What is not to like? White, I suppose, could trade the move bishop to f4, but then if you play bishop to e6, you will defend this pawn, you're about to castle queenside. The white king doesn't really have an obvious place to shelter himself, and surely black is better in this position. Okay, to end our video, let's give white a slightly better move. Once we capture the pawn, the best move for white is this move knight to f3 because it develops, protects this pawn, and it prevents this e5 counterplay that we were talking about. However, black can just play the move knight f6, and then when white plays e3, notice white cannot play e4 because we guarded that square. Again, I would not advise trying to defend the pawn. Instead, the simple move e6, and after white finally gets this pawn back, now we play c5 to challenge the center. And here, black is probably about equal. Black in some lines will capture, and when white takes back, white will end up with an isolated queen pawn. I hope you've watched all my videos on how to play with and against the isolated queen pawn. If you haven't, we'll probably drop them in the notes to this video. Also, black is not in a big hurry to capture. Pretend white castles in this position. If you take, you're probably helping white bring more pieces to the center. Black usually plays the very simple move a6 with the plan of b5, and when the bishop moves, bishop to b7 is a great diagonal for the bishop. And if white ever takes this pawn, then black can just trade queens, get the pawn back. White no longer has any more pawns in the center than black does, and black has basically equalized here in the opening. White might be up like a tempo or something, but that's pretty normal for white to be up one move in development. So you can see here, it's actually solid to capture the pawn in the queen's gambit, to accept that gambit, but my goal is not going to be to keep the pawn. My goal is to get it back, or catch up in development, and break up white's center. Do not fear the queen's gambit. It is, after all, the TV series that made our game so big. Who's in for season 2? I am.